Hello and welcome. I'm Emily Peet-Lukes, and this is Appfire Presents the best ITSM show by Appfire. Today, we've got Evn Tomeny joining us to talk about managing IT escalations, 3 key steps to take and common mistakes to avoid. So hang tight. We'll be right back with 10 minutes of expert advice.
Appfire presents the best ITSM show by Appfire.
Hey, Evn, how are you today?
Hey, Emily, I'm so great. Thanks for having me. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for joining us on the show.
Absolutely.
So, today we're talking about properly handling IT escalations and some common mistakes that people tend to make in the process. So, can you tell us why is it so important for IT teams to manage escalations in a certain way?
Yeah, so it's super important because IT escalations are the only time, really, when you have more than one person responsible for handling end user support. So you have that handoff from one person to the next. You have multiple people involved. So there's going to be communication not only with your end users, but also with the other people involved in support. And all of that leads to a longer a longer resolution time, right? So it takes longer to handle an issue when it has to be escalated. So for all those reasons, it's super important to make sure that escalations are smooth and efficient and effective.
That makes sense. Yes, absolutely. So can you walk me through some things we should avoid and some things that we should do instead?
Yeah, absolutely. I love this framework. So the first thing that I'll say we should avoid is assuming that people will figure it out themselves. So you might look at your IT teams and think, I have IT support and IT operations and IT security, maybe identity and access management. And all these teams work together all the time, so they'll be able to figure it out, right? If you use that approach, you're going to have as many different approaches to escalations as you do people on your team. And we never want that.
Right.
So what you should do instead is clearly define and document a process for escalations. And I really do mean document. It's not enough just to sit down and talk with the teams and tell them how it's done. You have to make sure that it's written down, that people have read it and agreed to it, and they have a document that they can go back to and view and make sure that they're still handling it correctly.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, so I'll dive right into the second one.
Yes.
This one's honestly my favorite. The second thing that you really have to avoid doing is throwing it over the wall.
Okay.
What I mean by that is avoid simply moving an issue from one team to another. Just because maybe the IT security team needs to ultimately do the work to resolve an issue, that doesn't mean you should pass it to them and forget about it. In fact, I tend to think that the team that receives the initial issue should always be responsible for resolving that issue. Whether you have to work with another team to get the work done, they should be responsible for the end user communication. They should be responsible for ultimately saying, yes, we completed this issue. It also means that you're able to hire people for your IT support team who are great at customer support. And then you're able to keep some of those back office IT folks, the ones I'm talking about.
Yes.
They're super, super good at resolving things, but don't always have the best bedside manner. Right. It's okay. They don't have to be at the bedside. Your IT support team can keep the issue and then maybe farm the work out to the team that needs to get it done.
Yeah, that makes sense. Keep people in their strengths. And also, I think we definitely have a tendency of thinking that passing something along and off of our plate means that it's going to be handled. But actually, it ends up sometimes being like a game of telephone, right? Where it gets passed off, but then the original intent gets misplaced. So having that like central understanding that the team that started it's going to end with it, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and that actually, your point about playing this game of telephone and not being sure where something really lies, that brings me to the third thing that we need to avoid, which is just to assume that it's going well, right? Because you don't hear negative feedback about your escalation process doesn't necessarily mean that it's working.
Right.
A lot of times it might mean that customers don't know issues are being escalated, so they don't know to complain about the escalation process. But we really need to have a firm process for analyzing and monitoring escalation trends. You've probably heard it before, but if it's worth doing, it's worth reporting.
Okay. Yes, that makes sense.
Yeah, so take the time to make sure you have a structure for, you have SLAs for every issue that comes in. Make sure you have separate SLAs for every issue that gets escalated. Make sure that you're still tracking the amount of time that it takes. And most importantly, track customer feedback. If you have customer satisfaction scores for all of your end user support requests, make sure that you're splitting them up between the ones that were escalated and the ones that weren't escalated. Make sure you know if escalations are hurting your customer satisfaction, because if they are, it probably means you need to do something better.
Wow. Yes, that makes so much sense. I think, again, this idea of like set it and forget it, that just doesn't see the importance of escalations like holistically. It's just kind of, you know, taking something off the plate and moving on. And it sounds like, especially when dealing with customer satisfaction, having a more holistic approach, seeing it from start to finish, and making sure the proper documentation and reporting is being done is going to be the key to evolving your processes and making them better.
Yeah, definitely. And when you're defining that process, make sure you define a single person who is responsible for the end-to-end life cycle of support. It might be on your support team, it might be a director in IT, but make sure there's someone whose responsibility it is to understand what that life cycle looks like, because it changes depending on which teams are involved, and sometimes multiple escalation teams get involved. And we need to understand what that life cycle looks like.
Yeah, having that ownership, then being able to see it in that life cycle process. Yes, absolutely.
Ownership is key here, right? Is not only over the whole end-to-end process, but the team that receives the issue should continue to maintain that ownership over the issue.
Yes, absolutely. So it sounds like that with all these processes and reporting, that there's probably some helpful tools that can be used to, manage escalations appropriately and efficiently and effectively.
Yeah, for sure. Especially if your team uses Jira Service Management. We have a bunch of tools here at Appfire that can be super helpful in this process. I'll highlight a few of them.
Okay.
The first is our workflow and automation tool called JMWE, Jira MISC Workflow Extensions. Super useful for the way that I personally like to handle these escalations is that I'll leave the original ticket in the original project, and I'll create a linked issue in the new project so that they have all the information. We copy all the fields that are relevant. They have all the information, but they're not actually responsible for communicating with the end user. They're responsible for communicating with me. And then I go back to the end user and continue that communication. So the end user only has one person who they have to speak to, one person they get to know throughout their whole support journey.
Oh, that's great. That one point of contact is so helpful when
exactly.
For sure. Yes.
I also love to highlight Kamala Document Management, a Confluence app that we have, which is really great for taking this kind of documentation that I was talking about, clearly defined documentation, making sure that it's approved by the right parties, and then making sure that the right people read it. Really important to have everyone on your team confirm that they've read the escalation process. And then finally, the last step that I talked about was analyzing trends. So I love to highlight Dashboard Hub from Appfire, which is super useful for reporting, not only on SLAs, but closure rates, customer satisfaction rates, anything that you want to track as part of an escalation process, or just as part of the regular running of an IT support team. Dashboard Hub can do for you.
Yeah, that's awesome. Reporting can be so satisfying because it really it's great to see, metrics, see them grow, see them change. That's great to have.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if you start to do things well over time, reporting can be a really joyful experience.
Absolutely. So where can people learn more about these tools and learn more about processes?
Yeah, so there's a really helpful resource at hub.appfire.com/ITSM. There's going to be all kinds of ITSM resources there. You'll find our full solution, which includes all 3 of those apps that I mentioned, plus many more.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much, Evn. This has been great.
Yeah, I really appreciated the chance to chat.
Of course, come back anytime. So that's it for this episode of Appfire Presents the Best ITSM Show by Appfire. We'll see you next time.